It's October 17th, 1933. A seemingly normal issue of the Negro World has just been released. There's nothing special about this edition's stories, just a celebration of Liberian independence, a story about Dominican women's suffrage, and an ad for a Halloween event held by the UNIA's Boston division, and a small passage written by a man by the name of Marcus Garvey. If you were to read this in 1933, you wouldn't think anything of it. You might not know what the UNIA is, or even remember the name Marcus Garvey, but only 10 years prior, Garvey and the UNIA were the top of the civil rights world. A once international organization in the UNIA is now fractured and dying. Garvey, a political activist who was once the adversary of some of the most influential civil rights leaders in US history, now lives in Jamaica, and his only voice left here in the States is this small section of the Negro World, which in itself was a once successful paper, boasting a circulation of over 200,000. But now it's dying, and this is its final issue. How did we get here? It's August 17th, 1887. Marcus Garvey was born in St. Ann's Bay, Jamaica, and Garvey would spend most of his young life attending school and learning to read in his father's library, as his parents were somewhat wealthy in the area. By the time he was 14, he left St. Ann's and traveled to Kingston, where he would work as a printer's apprentice under his godfather. During his work, he would listen to his godfather reminisce about George William Gordon and the now long-past slave revolts of Jamaica. He would listen to these stories for hours, and looking back, it's not hard to see where the inspiration of his future work came from. In 1908, Garvey would be promoted to manager of a printing firm in Kingston. With this new position, he led a strike for higher wages and better working conditions. The strike would eventually fail, but this was just the beginning of Garvey's activism. During this time, Garvey learned the art of public speaking at churches and other public forums, where he would self-teach himself how to invigorate a crowd. This would pay off later in his life, and historian Raphael Njoku describes Garvey saying that, quote, his ability to whip up a mass following among African Americans was unmatched until the time of Martin Luther King Jr. While living in Jamaica, Garvey realized that those who had the darkest skin would be exploited in the Jamaican society. This would lead him to wonder if Africans faced the same discrimination in other countries. So in 1910, he toured Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, and Venezuela to find out if Africans in these countries shared the same social experiences as those in Jamaica. During this trip, however, the British colonial regime would exile him to London, where he would continue his studies. His time in London would prove to be a pivotal point in his life. While in Europe, Garvey saw the same treatment of Africans as he saw in the New World. No matter where he went, Africans were at the bottom of the social ladder. Later in life, he would write in his autobiography that no matter where he went, he was reminded that you are black. Later, this would lead him to investigating the conditions of African Americans, and he would later read Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery. Washington would heavily influence Garvey's views, and Garvey's later proclamations followed the same ideas of economic growth for Africans that Washington preached years before him. Later in life, Garvey would write of his time in Europe, stating that, then my doom, if I may so call it, of being a race leader dawned upon me in London. After I had traveled through almost half of Europe, I asked, where is the black man's government? This was a question he looked to answer. With his purpose found, he would head back to Jamaica in 1914. Garvey would later describe returning, saying that I could remain in London no longer. My brain was afire. Immediately I bought a ship for Jamaica. The Universal Negro Improvement Association was founded and organized 5 days after my arrival, with the program of uniting all the Negro people of the world into one giant body to establish a country and a government absolutely their own.
The cry is raised all over the world of Canada for the Canadians, of America for the Americans, of England for the English, of France for the French, of Germany for the Germans. Do you think it unreasonable that we, the blacks of the world, should raise the cry of Africa for the Africans?
With the UNIA created and a mission in mind, Garvey would move to the United States in 1916. Why? Well, there was two reasons Garvey had in mind. The first was that the US presented a logistical advantage for Garvey in his future business ventures. And the second was Liberia. Liberia is a small country in West Africa, originally an American colony established for African Americans in 1822, but eventually it gained its independence by 1847. But by 1916, it was one of the only nations in Africa not controlled by a European power, and Garvey saw this as the perfect spot to establish an African government, and him, along with the UNIA, would later work to colonize it. Upon his arrival in America, Garvey would spend a year touring 38 of the then 48 US states. During his travels, he would give lectures at local African American organizations, meet prominent African American leaders such as Ida B. Wells in Chicago or John Edward Bruce in Yonkers, and investigate black business ventures, writing later that, "I have seen the Negro banks in Washington and Chicago, stores, cafes, restaurants, theaters, and real estate agencies that fill my heart with joy to realize that at one center of Negrodom, at least the people of the race have sufficient pride to do things for themselves." By 1918, Garvey officially set up the first US chapter of the UNIA in New York City. Along with this, he opened a restaurant and a newspaper called the Negro World. Both the UNIA and the Negro World would quickly take off in the States and elevate Garvey's message in the civil rights world. Originally, Garvey didn't have any plans on staying in the US. Instead, he planned on traveling back to Jamaica after he set up his business ventures. But a chance encounter with W.E.B. Du Bois would shape his decision to stay. As he met with the NAACP staff, he saw that other than Du Bois, Augustus G. Dill, a business manager of the Crisis magazine, and an office assistant, the entire staff was white. He was shocked by this staff and believed that the only advancement the NAACP had to offer was to become as white as possible. To quote Raphael Njoku, "After a short talk with Du Bois, Garvey became so disgusted with the man and his principles that the thought that he had never contemplated entered his mind. That of remaining in America to teach Du Bois and his group what real race pride meant." This wouldn't be the last of Garvey's clashes with Du Bois. For a few years, Du Bois didn't publicly mention his disdain for Garvey, but in 1920, Du Bois would publish a two-part essay about Garvey in Crisis magazine. Historically speaking, this isn't surprising. Garvey was a follower of Booker T. Washington, and Washington just so happened to be a rival of Du Bois only a few decades earlier. Where Du Bois was the figurehead of the NAACP, Garvey and the UNIA was his foil. Polar opposites, both in ideology and strategy, Garvey and Du Bois were adversaries for the length of their careers. In his essay, Du Bois would describe Garvey as having very serious defects of temperament and training. He is dictatorial, domineering, inordinately vain, and very suspicious. Along with this attack on character, Du Bois also looked to discredit Garvey's success, stating that in the United States, his movement for many years languished, until at last, with the increased migration from the West Indies during the war, he succeeded in establishing a strong nucleus in the Harlem district of New York City. Although this observation does have some factual standing, it doesn't show the full story. This was the NAACP's membership from the years 1913 to 1930. Admittedly small numbers when compared to the UNIA's membership. Although no exact number is known due to poor record keeping by the UNIA, it is generally believed that it was much larger than the NAACP during its prime. The UNIA was the dominant civil rights organization in the world at its time. And that was no accident. Garvey found much more success in the NAACP in rural America, as much of his message spoke to those who lived in these areas. Talks of economic independence and black wealth spoke straight to rural African Americans who grew up in the sharecropping societies of the South. The NAACP was viewed as the black elite, and to some out of touch with the struggles of African Americans, but Garvey gave them an alternative. He advocated for black wealth and encouraged self-defense from white tyranny. These were messages rural African Americans liked, and it was a message that those such as Du Bois hated. And since Du Bois and the NAACP wouldn't preach this message, many chose to go to the Church of Garvey. Only 2 years after the first UNIA branch was founded, Marcus Garvey had built an empire. Garvey opened many business ventures, such as the Negro Factories Corporation, which was a collection of businesses in Harlem. Restaurants, grocery stores, laundries, a doll factory, a hat factory, a printing press, a trucking business, and even a hotel all ran under the Negro Factories Corporation. It employed over 1,000 employees and was the primary way of keeping the UNIA self-sufficient. There was also the Black Star Line, which was a shipping company that also served the purpose of moving people and supplies to the UNIA's colonization efforts. But nothing was quite as successful as the Negro World. The Negro World became one of the most successful black papers in the world. The mouthpiece of Garvey and the UNIA, the Negro World saw worldwide circulation. The paper would be read by UNIA members and discussed at meetings. Tony Martin, author of Marcus Garvey, Hero, describes the Negro World as akin to the Bible in a church service. Africans around the globe loved the Negro World, but governments didn't. The British and the French quickly banned the publication due to its preachings of race pride and anti-colonialism, but that didn't stop the Negro World. Seamen would smuggle the paper into places it was banned, to the point where colonial officials would fine and even imprison those who had the publication. With the success of the UNIA, the Negro World, and the Negro Factory Corporations, along with the Black Star Line, Marcus Garvey's empire was almost complete. In August of 1920, the UNIA would host the first International Convention of the Negro People of the World. A parade was held in celebration, with Black Star Line sailors in full uniform, UNIA juveniles, and Garvey himself, dressed in a military uniform. Over 25,000 people would flock to Madison Square Garden and fill the arena's 20,789 person capacity. People overflowed into the surrounding areas as delegates from around the globe met at this historic event. They produced the Declaration of the Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World, a list of 54 proclamations that ended with the statement, "These rights we believe to be justly ours, and proper for the protection of the Negro race at large. And because of this belief, we, on behalf of the 400 million Negroes of the world, do pledge herein the sacred blood of the race in defense, and we hereby subscribe our names as a guarantee of the truthfulness and faithfulness hereof. In the presence of Almighty God, on this 13th day of August in the year of our Lord 1920. This was their Declaration of Independence. This was the founding of a nation. And Garvey had been elected their president. Garvey was at the top of the world. But the problem with being at the top is you can only go down. After the International Convention, the cracks in the UNIA began to show. Liberian colonization plans would be dashed in 1921, 23, and 24. This was mainly due to heavy interference from the combined forces of the French, British, and Liberian governments. Since the Black Star Line was owned only by African Americans, Garvey was constantly pushing the sales of stock. This was an extremely lucrative business, as some estimates say the Black Star Line raised over $750,000 from 1919 to 1921. Today, that would be worth almost $11 million. The Black Star Line was in its prime, but then the unthinkable happened. In 1922, Garvey was arrested for mail fraud due to his advertising of stock with the Black Star Line. His case would be delayed multiple times, but by 1923 he was found guilty and was given the maximum sentence. During this time, Garvey threw out many theories, all of which were on the front page of the Negro World, from blaming the NAACP to claiming that because the prosecutor was Jewish he was biased against him. Garvey looked for any reason to claim that the system was rigged against him. He was in full nosedive. Out of all the theories that Garvey and his allies pushed at the time, there is one that does have some solid standing, and that is that the federal government was looking to get rid of him and the UNIA, which a memo from J. Edgar Hoover at the time seems to indicate this. On October 11, 1919, Hoover would write to Special Agent Ridgely, quote, "Garvey is a West Indian Negro, and in addition to his activities in endeavoring to establish the Black Star Line Steamship Corporation, he has also been particularly active among the radical elements in the New York City in agitating the Negro movement. Unfortunately, however, he has not yet violated any federal law whereby he could be proceeded against on the grounds of being an undesirable alien. From the point of view of deportation, it occurs to me, however, from the attached clipping, that there might be some proceeding against him for fraud in connection with his Black Star Line propaganda. And for this reason, I am transmitting the communication to you for your appropriate attention." Garvey's imprisonment didn't stop him. During his time in U.S. prison, Garvey would still write letters that would still be published in the Negro world. In his first letter from a federal prison in Atlanta, Garvey would write, "The civilization of today is gone drunk and crazy with its power, and by such it seeks through injustice, fraud, and lies to crush the unfortunate. But if I am apparently crushed by the system of influence and misdirected power, my cause shall rise again to plague the conscience of corrupt. For this I am satisfied, and for you I repeat, I am glad to suffer and even die. Again I say, cheer up, for better days are ahead. I shall write the history that will inspire the millions that are coming, and leave the prosperity of our enemies to reckon with the hosts for the deeds of their fathers." Even from prison, Garvey would continue to wage war against W.E.B. Du Bois, calling him an unfortunate mulatto who bewails every day the drop of Negro blood in his veins. This would only lead to a smear campaign between the two in the press, such as Du Bois's 1924 article in the Crisis magazine, where he would say, "Garvey is without a doubt the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America and in the world. He is either a lunatic or a traitor. The American Negroes have endured the wretch all too long with fine restraint and every effort at cooperation and understanding, but the end has come. Every man who apologizes for or defends Marcus Garvey from this date forth writes himself down as unworthy of the countenance of decent Americans." These back and forth attacks would continue for the next few years. Garvey would later be deported back to Jamaica. He would continue to try to manage the UNIA and the Negro world from Kingston, but the ship was already sinking. The UNIA was breaking apart due to the leadership vacuum, and the Negro world circulation would also begin to decline. And that brings us back to here, the last issue of the Negro world. Garvey is still here trying to command his nation from across the seas, and the UNIA is still trying to operate. But this was the end. Just as quickly as Garvey rose to power, he fell back to the earth. Garvey would move to London, where he would eventually pass away. Although Garvey was gone, his legacy would live on. His ideas of black nationalism and black pride would continue throughout the century, inspiring prominent figures such as Malcolm X. And do you remember that chart about NAACP membership from earlier? Garvey had revolutionized the civil rights world. As the NAACP and other civil rights organizations would revamp their strategies in the following decades to mimic the grassroots success Garvey had found. This would lead in a surge of NAACP membership and create the grassroots movement we remember the civil rights era for. So although Garvey was gone, his influence lived on, and he will forever be cemented as one of the most influential civil rights leaders in history.